There has been a great deal of controversy ever since President Trump made the startling and, in my opinion, refreshing claim that if NATO is not going to pay up on its dues, America should not defend it, nor should it bankroll any of its member nations.
One of the presidents of a big country stood up and said, well, sir, if we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us? I said, you didn't pay? You're delinquent? He said, yes, let's say that happened. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay. You got to pay your bills.
To this claim, he was met with a bunch of angered responses, including from Joe Biden, who said from the White House that Donald Trump's comment was dumb, shameful, dangerous, and un-American. And he went on to say that no other president in our history has ever bowed down to a Russian dictator. Let me say this as clearly as I can. I never will. Now, for those of you who are astute political observers, for those of you who are familiar with my work as well, you will know that I always make it a point to point out when subterfuge and manipulation is being used against you by your politicians who are attempting to sell you a bad bill of goods in the name of it being a good bill of goods. What Biden is doing here is what we call proximity ethics. When we assess the goodness or the badness of a particular idea, not on its own merits, not on if the idea itself is bad or good, but on if the idea is close to things that may be bad or good according to some perspective. So NATO happens to be close to Russia and the entire geopolitical situation surrounding Russia. And so Biden, by association and proximity, are linking the two things together as if if you are against one, you must support the other. Not only is this what we call in logic a false dichotomy, a false choice, it's just plain manipulation of language. It's dishonest, and it's an attack on the mind that has become so common over the past 60 or 70 plus years in America and in the West, and has made populations of many countries accept ideas that are otherwise untenable and against their own self-interest. Which brings me to the topic of today's video. In my opinion, Donald Trump did not go far enough in his critique of NATO. It's one thing to say that someone should be paying their dues and they should be a contributing member of a group. But what if the group itself is fundamentally, morally, philosophically corrupt down to its core foundations and structurally could not possibly affirm its core foundations due to how many power centers and how many conflicting relationships the group is linked into? This is precisely the case of NATO. I don't care about the details of NATO not paying their fair share. That is simply an after effect of the origin of a group that, in my opinion, should not exist in our current era and has not been fighting for world peace or America's best interest or the best interest of many countries in the world, despite their claims to the contrary, and has instead destabilized the world and kept the world under an iron-fisted geopolitical order that does nothing more than embolden and empower those in the ruling class and weaken the average citizens of, ironically, NATO member nations and every other nation that has the displeasure of coming into contact with NATO and its geopolitical forces. That's the issue. Yes, NATO's not paying their fair share, but I don't care about that. I care about the soundness, the fundamental soundness of the organization. This organization has not been sound since its founding. And so it is my argument that the United States must not only abandon NATO, but it must set a precedent within its own nation that we will follow the wise advice of George Washington, who in his admonitions said, do not get involved in entangling alliances, and we will set up a hedge to protect our nation and our people from getting involved in any other further entangling alliances as time persists. Now, I have multiple objections for our involvement in NATO, and I intend to go down the list of them one by one. My first rejection of NATO is that NATO, its core foundations, is founded on a perverted philosophy. What do I mean? Well, so let's actually discuss NATO's origins for a moment. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was founded in April 4th of 1949, and its charter lays out its principles its missions, and its goals. In other words, its charter is part of its foundation. Now, NATO's charter, the preamble says the following: the parties to this treaty reaffirm their faith in the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and their desire to live in a peace with all peoples and all governments. You see where this is going? They are determined to safeguard the freedom, common heritage, and civilization of peoples founded on the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. They seek to promote stability and well-being in the North Atlantic area. They are resolved to unite their efforts for collective defense and the preservation of peace and security. They therefore agree to this North Atlantic Treaty. Now, without even going into the articles of the treaty, which is very short, by the way, I have a link in my description if you guys want to read it. It's very short. I encourage you all to read it for your own elucidation. The preamble sets out a very clear value statement. And those values that are stated, the values of internationalism, international cooperation, the values of trying to uphold the standard of universal morality in all nations, is basically the credo of NATO and has been the pretext it has used to force itself on multiple countries to the point of destabilizing them, breaking the law, and also possibly also committing war crimes. We'll discuss that in a split second here. And these ideas, fundamentally, in their proper context, are good and they are noble. The ideas of a universal kind of morality based on the individual, based on self-governing peoples, based on the consent of the governed, are not democratic ideas, fundamentally. They are classically Republican ideas that flow from the word res publica, modeled by the Romans and perfected by the Americans in the Enlightenment era. They are fundamentally good ideas that help balance out power, help restrict the corruptive uses of power, and empower individual man to seek his potential in the context of an objective reality dictated by natural law more than he could do if he was in a really restricted and limited social and political order. But the problem arose in the 20th century when the old school republicanism, old school classical liberalism, old school American conservatism became traded for a fundamentally anti-American, a fundamentally un-American, and a fundamentally authoritarian strain of what is called liberalism, which is called progressive liberalism, which said that the aims of certain ideas like equality and justice are not rooted in these objective laws that exist in reality. They're not rooted in just strictly in the individual. They are instead rooted in the desire to bring forth change through force. And so we should empower the government to bring forth equality. We should empower the government to change society and be a change agent in society. Of course, when you use force to change society, you don't get change in any positive direction. You get restriction, you get lost potential, and you get chaos and disorder, as we see when governments overact their limits and become authoritarian. It's not pretty because it goes against the fundamental axioms of the political and moral universe. Different story, different day. So then this idea, after World War II, develops into the post-war consensus and says, okay, we support this idea of individual rights, but we're going to support it on the level of wanting to inflict our own interpretation of it onto certain civilizations. And not only that, it's no longer going to be a role rooted to the nation state, rooted to the local context of self-governance. It's instead going to be a principle that is rooted in the sort of globalistic, internationalistic, rules-based, international system that has nothing to do with the concerns of particular nations. The moment you divorce strong morality from a local, limited context is the moment you have no morality at all. You just have nice rhetoric that you can use to get away with evil. The NATO's principles after the post-war consensus were convinced that national sovereignty and nationalism as a means of defending national sovereignty was fundamentally bad because of the rise of Hitler. And so we needed to get rid of national sovereignty. We need to limit the amount of self-governance, and we need to put the futures of our nations into the centralized force, the Atlantic Council, NATO, the UN, so they can dictate and control what actually happens. And of course, we saw decades of geopolitical policy created after this happened, the UN's Declaration of Human Rights, which says that a woman getting an abortion is a right and people being free from poverty is a right, when both of those things are services, not rights. But still, the UN's same moral framework is based off of the perversion of the framework of universal morality that NATO uses. So the truth is, those principles, you can't uphold these principles on an international level because these principles require the local nature of self-governance to actually be achieved in reality. So NATO perverted sound classical liberalism, turned it into progressive internationalist interventionist type liberalism, which is not liberalism at all, and then inflicted it upon nations time after time. Look at Yugoslavia, for example. In the 90s, NATO bombed Yugoslavia without getting permission from the UN, which, by the way, their own internal rules say that they have to get permission from the UN to do these things. They illegally bombed Yugoslavia, all in the name of preventing a moral catastrophe and defeating and deposing dictatorial forces under the name of these abstract principles. NATO was involved in Afghanistan. I'll get to that in a little bit. They were involved in the boondoggle that was, and they were involved in the efforts to nation build by way of the Afghanistan Compact, which was this plan that NATO and its allies put together for Afghanistan to have a better nation, and they justified it on the basis of these universal principles. The issue is not universal principles. The issue is perverting morality and perverting sound ideas to further your own political agenda, and that is NATO's legacy, unfortunately. So we shouldn't be surprised that in the 90s, when NATO promised the Soviet Union would not expand, it expanded. We should not be surprised that NATO has been constantly etching towards getting more power. We should not be surprised that NATO has intervened in several situations, like in Libya, has deposed Gaddafi after propping up and funding Gaddafi, sent the country into a civil war where rights were violated in all kinds of ways due to the chaos and disorder, provided them no support whatsoever, all in the name of universal morality. No, it's not universal morality. It's tyranny and geopolitical order justified by appealing to the heart. There are two dimensions of moral thinking. There's the mind and the heart. If you can appeal to the mind and saying, okay, all individuals have rights, which is a rational statement, then you can appeal to the heart and saying we can't allow atrocity to happen. You've just completed the two dimensions of moral and political thinking, and you've been able to lock in people into presuppositions that may be fundamentally incorrect. NATO is a practice in manipulation and rhetoric that leads to mass murder. That's why it's fundamentally evil. Forget the business deals. It is a fundamentally evil organization that tries to use goodness to show it from its sins. This kind of covers the next point I was going to use, that NATO uses these values as a skin suit to justify itself. When NATO went into Libya, for example, Obama said, with the approval of NATO, that Gaddafi was a dictator and we cannot stand by while someone says, I'll have no mercy on my citizens. And yet NATO killed a lot of people, like over 600 citizens in Yugoslavia. NATO's killed a lot of people in Iraq and Afghanistan. A lot of innocent people that had no reason to die. And yet they don't hold themselves to the same standard because they're using that skin suit of universal morality to justify evil. See what happens? The truth is, even if NATO truly did want to stick to a pure version of those values, its structure and the context it exists in does not enable it to follow any kind of morality beyond the norms of power. What do I mean? The norms of power are such that power seeks to perpetuate itself, preserve itself, and like a parasite, leech from what it is applied to. Which is why when people get into office in America, for example, or any place, they may come in with all these values and morality, but they end up taking deals from lobbyists. They end up doing backroom deals in general. They end up going for political expediency, not because it's just how the system works, but because by its very nature, power is a force that has its own set of rules that oftentimes exclude morality. So even if NATO, as one of the most powerful geopolitical organizations in the world, as the military arm of the UN, as the enforcer of the liberal international order, you see how that's going these days, it was a good idea that, again, that was inflicted by force and followed by people that don't actually have the principles of cooperation and a good society and natural law, and therefore they perverted it, which then therefore led to its collapse. But still, NATO was the enforcer of that. When you have all of this power structure, there are going to be many different actors vying for control of what the power structure does. America, since it provides most of the money, has actually been one of those biggest actors that vies over the control of what NATO does. America led NATO into Libya. America led NATO into Iraq. America led NATO into Afghanistan. America has led NATO into many things. Yes, it's true. But that does not absolve NATO as an alliance from its sins. All it does is simply say, the structure is even more unkempt, it's even more flawed, and it's a danger if a single country can lead an entire, multiple militaries into mass murder. The truth is, NATO exists to establish an iron-fisted control over geopolitical order. NATO never was there just for security purposes. That's the idea. Right in the charter, it says security purposes. And yet, is killing innocent civilians in Libya and Yugoslavia and Iraq a security purpose? Is trying to nation build in Afghanistan, a country that was not a NATO nation, a security purpose? No. In fact, there was this great paper that actually doesn't make the same point, but it actually makes very similar points as to the integrity of NATO's mission in Afghanistan. It's called Operationally Agile but Strategically Lacking, NATO's Bruising Years in Afghanistan, written by Sten Running and Paul Hild. And basically in the abstract, they say that for more than 20 years, NATO engaged in security assistance in Afghanistan. The engagement represented a colossal political military investment and regime renewal. The return of the Taliban to power in 2021 defines a defeat for NATO, we argue. Defeat followed in part from NATO's strategy deficit. The alliance did not adequately focus on Afghanistan's political fundamentals. It committed to a comprehensive approach, campaign blueprint that defied reality, and its decision-making process was too cumbersome and loaded with political interests to correct course. We also argue that part of the reason for failure resides outside of NATO, with multiple other actors involved in the conflict. Faced with such complexity, NATO in fact proved operationally agile and resilient. We find that NATO is aware of this challenge of operational agility, but that there is no quick fix to what it is. Well, that leads me to my next point. The fact that NATO was captured by these different coinciding political interests, as these two astute gentlemen say, just proves that they are part of the superstructure of international organizations that are captured by political concerns, not moral concerns, not principles concerns, or the UN's favorite phrase, human rights concerns. They're captured by political concerns of the norms of power, and by being captured by these political concerns and seeking to push their agenda upon nations, they're part of the agenda to destroy national sovereignty and limit national self-determination. Even beyond NATO's mismanagement of the Afghanistan situation, which, by the way, if they really were an organization based on these universal values and setting them up in societies, they would have had a better way to nation build or whatever. Problem is, nation building doesn't work because you can't impose foreign values upon a country that you personally believe in, that culture doesn't believe in, and expect it to work. It doesn't work that way because Afghanistan, and a lot of the Middle East, has been under a very different notion than Western universalism for a very, very long time. So it didn't work then, wouldn't work now. And it just exposed that NATO was more of like a point-and-shoot organization. They are a military alliance based on the hardcore rules of political realism, which means they don't care about values or first principles. They care about what works and how it works in the context of how they can get more power. That's it. But you only have to forget Afghanistan. If you consider that NATO, and I'll close on this, is first and foremost aligned with the United Nations and their principles, and then consider how the United Nations has used the moral idea of human rights as a bludgeon to attack America's own domestic policy, the need to separate from NATO becomes even more important. I can count two instances, so there's been more, but two prominent ones that come to mind in recent history. The United Nations, for example, suggested, there's an article here, that the federal government must force states to repeal marijuana legalization to comply with an international treaty. When Donald Trump tried to repeal Obamacare, The United Nations warned him that he'd be violating human rights if he tried to repeal Obamacare. What gives an international organization, a detached body of bureaucrats, the moral right to govern the policies of a particular nation, including our nation? Nothing except the illegitimate consent of those in power who seek to gain things by being part of those international compacts that are not agreed to by the American people. Gain something. That is the only thing that gives them the ability to do that, but it's not a real ability, it's a counterfeit power. The American people were skeptical of international organizations like the UN in the early 1920s, which is why they silently rejected the League of Nations and the nonsense they tried to get us involved in. But unfortunately, the post-war consensus suspended the moral thinking of many Americans, just like the war in Afghanistan suspended our moral thinking, because at first public opinion was against it, then it became for it, through manufactured consent, and it pushed them into a situation where sovereignty takes a backseat to the dealings of bureaucrats. If the NATO is a part of the superstructure, then it is fundamentally not just a threat to America. It's a threat to every single member nation that would be part of this security alliance. It doesn't secure anything except providing a false sense of security by brass tacks of having someone else provide your security for you, in this case America, which was the complaint of Trump. But in all reality, it's a strong danger to the nation's core principle, which is sovereignty and the rights of the individuals, because of the organizations it gives legitimacy to have over the nation's affairs, like the UN. To sum up, my friends, my objections to NATO, I'll sum them up again. It's founded on a perverted philosophy, a perversion of universal morality. Even if the philosophy was pure, it is twisted by the context of power and therefore cannot actually succeed in NATO or any other international organization. NATO uses these values as a skin suit to destabilize the world and maintain hold over their own geopolitical order. NATO has also been a part of the superstructure that is eroding national sovereignty and national self-determination. My friends, it seems to me that if you really care about America's health, its preservation, and its security, entangling alliances like NATO and its other cousins that are part of the same superstructure that it occupies, the UN, Atlantic Council, everything else, should be but simple, distant names for the American. These should be organizations that we have nothing to do with and that we put to the side so we can fundamentally put our country first. This is not pretty rhetoric. This is simply an acknowledgement of what every nation needs to survive and what every nation needs to ensure that its sovereignty is not impugned either by rulings from on high in some international body or by the conflicts those international bodies wish to get get America or any other nation involved in, which may injure our economic or our national security. Just look at the Ukraine situation. America's economic security and national security have never been in a more dangerous place in the past 30 plus years. My friends, America must abandon NATO, and by doing that, secure its future for generations. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe, donate, all that good stuff. Be sure to support the channel if you want to, if you enjoy philosophical commentary on politics and social issues. And please also be sure to share our stuff. My friends, study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please, please, please stay pensive. Bye, guys.